Well, welcome back. In this unit, we're going to be focused on Chapter 12 of Harmer, which is on planning lessons. So you should have read Chapter 12 before watching this lecture. If you haven't had a chance, just go ahead and stop the video, take the time to read, come on back. And as I often do at the beginning of these presentations, I'd like to start by asking you to take a step back. Consider, why is it important for us to do the things that we do as teachers? And so in this case, why do we plan our lessons? Lesson planning is something that you're going to be doing throughout your career, and it's for your students' benefit as well as your own benefit. So it's really good for us to look at it closely today. And of course, your final project in this class is a comprehensive lesson plan as well, and so we'll be talking about that. There are a lot of reasons for planning. And the first is just to devote some time to thinking about your class. It's really important to take time to reflect on, what do my students need at this point? What do they need going forward? Planning suggests a level of professionalism and commitment. When you don't plan, it shows, and it really reflects as a lack of professionalism, a lack of concern for your work as an educator. Planning gives your lesson a framework. It gives it an overall shape. You may adapt, you may depart from the plan while you're teaching, but overall there will be this structure that you have put in place in your plan. Planning also gives you some material to fall back on. Things can go differently than we expect when we're teaching. Students may get it faster than we think. It may be necessary to move on to the next part of the sequence. It's really best to have a plan in place in that and in so many other unexpected situations. We can think of lesson plans as a proposal for action. So just like we talked about with course books, we shouldn't be bound to the lesson plan with no deviation. There's going to be unforeseen situations, and we need to be able to modify our approach, our plan, as the situation calls for. There may be pace differences than we expected. Students are working slower or faster than we thought. Some learning roadblocks or technical difficulties. Good teachers are flexible. We should be able to be open to sort of that magic moment when the classroom conversation goes in an unexpected but rich direction, and something a student says or does can actually just turn the lesson in another direction entirely. And we have to be able to change our plans midstream when that's necessary or when that's appropriate. Lesson planning should be built around objectives, clear outcomes or learning outcomes that indicate what the students will have learned by the end of the lesson. So it's not about what the teacher does. It's not what about the students do. It's really about what will the students have learned. And those learning outcomes need to be specific. They need to be measurable. They need to be demonstrable. Those are the key things we need to be keeping in mind when we think about objectives, and we'll talk more about that. But let's look at some examples of learning objectives. So in this table, if we think about those three criteria, specific, measurable, demonstrable, the column on the left are poorly written objectives. On the right, they're better. So on the left, we see students will learn the programming language Python. Well, that's really a vague statement. What does it mean to learn this programming language? Whereas on the right, we read students will use the programming language Python to complete a data mining analysis. So that's much more clear. It's much more specific that what we expect that our students will be able to do. Students will know the elements from the periodic table. Again, that is not a measurable outcome. What will it mean? How will we measure whether they know it or not? Whereas on the right, students will be able to identify the elements from the periodic table based on their symbols. That's measurable. We will be able to assess, are they able to match the symbol to the element? Students will be able to apply one of the many theories of social psychology and apply those theories to a number of real-world situations. This is just verbose. This is a situation where it seems like the person who wrote that just wanted to use a lot of big words to make it sound like they knew what they were doing. It needs to be much more concise. So students will be able to apply theories of social psychology to real-world situations. Perfect. In the next example, we see that there's both a course objective and then a learning objective. So we see students will be able to construct a sentence in Spanish using correct grammar and punctuation. That's the objective of the course. Then the learning objective says students will identify provinces in Spain on a map. How are these connected? The learning objective does not lead to the course objective in this case. Whereas on the right, course objective is the same, but the learning objective is students will be able to conjugate verbs correctly in the past tense. Yes, this learning objective will lead to our course objective of using correct grammar and punctuation. And, truthfully, I think the ones in this example or ones in this table could be improved. I think they could become more specific, more measurable, more demonstrable. How would you make them better? Take a moment to actually pause the video, look at them, think about how you could improve them. Well, when we think about the shape of our lesson planning, lessons need to have coherence. There should be a logical pattern to the lesson. There should be a connection between the activities. There should also be variety. We need to really be changing up the activities that we're doing in order to maintain student interest. And, if we're balancing those aspects of engage, study, and activate, it becomes easier to ensure that there is a variety of activities in our lesson planning. Harmer offers us a list of about 7 questions that are helpful when we go about lesson planning. So first, who exactly are the students for this activity? The makeup of the class will influence the way that we plan. So think back to that first unit that we did on learners. Things like, what is their first language? What are their learning styles? What are their multiple intelligences? All those different factors, age. When we're thinking about our learners, that should impact the way that we are planning. What do we want to do and why in terms of the activities, the skills, the language? What will be the learning outcomes? How long will it take? When it comes to time, we need to be conservative and realistic about how long things will take. How does it work? Kind of the logistical questions of who's going to do what first, how and when should we put students into groups, when do we give students instructions, all of those kind of logistical pieces. The instructions piece is crucial. If our ELLs don't understand the instructions, everything about this lesson is going to fall flat. What will be needed? What kind of materials are we going to need to have ready to hand? What might go wrong? Think realistically about this. Anticipate the problems that you think you or your learners are going to experience. And then how will it fit in with what comes before and what comes after? So our lessons, again, should be part of a sequence that has coherence. There are a variety of plan formats, and we'll look at the lesson plan template that we're using in this class, but any plan format is going to have a number of elements that are usually included, and those are kind of aligned to those planning questions we just looked at. They're going to include a description of the students, the aims and objectives, and again, those should be specific, so not mastery of a concept, so you would have something like mastery of a concept of irregular verbs, not something like have a good time. What will the procedures be? What are the anticipated problems? What extra activities and materials will you have available just in case? And then what materials are going to be needed in the classroom? In addition to individual lesson planning, we need to be thinking about lessons as part of a sequence. So it's important that students can be able to see a clear pattern of progress and a transparent topic link between our lessons. When we when we sequence our lessons, we need to make sure that our lessons are not totally predictable, because that can be really demotivating and unengaging for our students. We can avoid that issue of predictability by making sure that we're including a good balance of that engage, study, activate. By sequencing those things in different ways, we continue to keep our students interested. Ideally, a multi-lesson sequence has threads that run through them. Those threads could be language threads, like grammar and vocabulary pieces, skill threads, so reading, writing, listening, and speaking. But it shouldn't feel random to our students, like one lesson is completely disjointed from the next. They should see a thread running through. After a lesson, it really helps to be reflective about what just happened in that lesson. And so you can ask yourself, what will I do next time based on what we just did? Again, you want that cohesion. You don't want lessons to feel like they're completely disconnected. Was the activity successful? How do I know that? What exactly did students get from the activity? What did they learn? And why? You should try to get feedback from your students. That could be formal, like an exit ticket, or informal, just asking them, hey, how did that go? Try to get from them one thing that they liked, but that they want more of, and one thing that wasn't so great, what they want less of. Feedback can also be really helpful coming from a peer, having another teacher observe you and give you their take on what they think went really well and what they think could be better. That's a really normal thing in teaching practice today. You will be observed by peers, and you'll have the opportunity to observe your peers as well and learn from them things that you can try. Sometimes keeping a journal can be a good way to kind of structure some reflection into your teaching practice. So let's go over the lesson plan template that you're going to be using for your final project. So it looks a little bit different in this table on the screen now, but these are the same elements that you need to be including in your lesson plan for your final project. So the ELL level, again, refer to those WIDA can-do descriptors, grade level, approximate number of students, total lesson length, students' first language or languages, and you might be guessing at those L1s if you're not, if you don't have a class of your own that you're teaching right now. But you might look into what languages are spoken in the neighborhoods where you think you'd like to teach. Language domains that are used. So are they utilizing reading, writing, listening, speaking? Which ones is this lesson focused on? And then really some of the crucial parts of this lesson plan are those objectives, both a content objective and a language objective. Those, again, they must be measurable, they must be specific, or otherwise, truthfully, your language or your lesson can just fall apart. The content and the language objectives should go together. So like that example we've given of if you're discussing a particular event in history, that's a good time to also work on past tense formulation. Those objectives should be explicit, and students should be aware of the objectives. So maybe you're reading them out loud to the students. Maybe you're posting them on the board. They should actually know those things. We'll look at a few examples of some good and bad language objectives. I won't read them all here, but we'll go through a few of them. So some of the more problematic ones. Students will listen, speak, read, and write for information. Well, it's far too broad. Students will apply their knowledge of the reading. Again, this is not developed enough. What would it mean to apply their knowledge of the reading? What will that look like? How will we know what they have learned? Students will write a persuasive essay. Well, students writing an entire persuasive essay, that's far too large for one lesson. What's the objective in this particular piece that you're going to do in this lesson? Students will write down 4 interesting facts on Post-it notes. That is an activity, but that is not a learning goal. Students will analyze characterization in 2 short stories. That's actually a good learning objective, but it's an ELA. It's a content learning objective, not a language ESL learning objective. Students will learn the difference between famous and infamous. Well, that's one very small vocabulary point. It could be broader, and it should be more than just a vocabulary learning objective. Some better ones, students will be able to, so if you haven't seen that before, SWBAT, students will be able to tell a friend they like their outfit using a variety of compliments, such as, I love that sweater, or that color looks great on you. So that's excellent. That's a very clear, specific language function learning objective. Students will be able to use their knowledge of word roots to guess meaning of a group of words, all starting with inter in a reading passage. And if you want to read through the rest of these, just go ahead and pause the video, and this is available as a PDF as well in one of the resource folders on D2L. And of course, you have to keep in mind, your objectives are going to vary according to your students' levels. But these examples show the kind of specificity that we want. That specificity gives your objectives strength, and it makes them measurable. So here we have a few content and language objectives side by side, and they match to each other. So the example on the left is the content learning goal. The example on the right is the language learning goal. So students will be able to identify specific landforms on a map of South America, and students will be able to present an oral report about one landform and its influence on a country's history. Students will be able to identify reasons for why the Boston Tea Party happened. Students will be able to write a paragraph to persuade other colonists to help take part in the Boston Tea Party. Students will be able to identify an author's purpose for writing a text. Students will be able to orally justify their answer using this sentence starter. So we have a scaffolding strategy here, giving them a sentence starter. So the author's purpose for writing this text was to the reader. I know this because the text is. I actually think that these could be improved with some more specificity. So why don't you pause the video, give some thought to how each of these pairs could be improved. So here's an example of a content objective laid out with two language learning objectives that they've put that they've broken down by their students' levels. So the content is on poetry and on making inferences about figurative language. So you see students will be able to infer the author's intended effect of figurative language in a poem. And for the language objective, the lower level students are working on giving opinions using sentence starters and a word bank. Again, two different kinds of scaffolding incorporated there. Whereas the higher level students, the 4s and 5s, are creating multiple paragraphs analyzing the effect of figurative language in a poem. So they're working to analyze figurative language. There's a lot of other examples of good learning objectives for both content and language. And one of your activities today is to go through a folder in D2L called Resources for Creating Learning Objectives and SciOps Strategies. There's a lot in there on this stuff. So I highly suggest you spend at least half an hour looking through that folder, going through them, and really getting a sense of good objectives and SciOps strategies. So this is the next part of your lesson plan template. You'll need to indicate what materials and supplies you'll need and be specific about those. The classroom's physical configuration. So explain how you would set that up and why. Why is it important for your learning objectives? What support strategies will you use? And again, there's a great PDF on SciOp classroom strategies. That's in that same folder I just mentioned. It's also in the Major Assignment 4 folder. Check that out for a refresher on some of those things or ideas. Engagement. So this is the section where you'll talk about how you'll get your students thinking about the topic, get them excited. What will be that initial engagement activity? And how long will you need for it? Now, the teaching section, that's the meat, that's the lesson. How will you deliver the new content? Not just activities, but think carefully about how you will teach it. And don't forget to indicate how much time that will take as well. Study and application. So what activities will your students do to apply, to study, to practice this, both the content and the language? How much time will that take? And then evaluation. How will you assess whether your students have achieved your objectives? It can be formal, it can be informal, it could be both, but be specific and note the time that you're going to need for those also. And knowing that your students are going to have different learning needs in your classes, how will you differentiate instruction? What will that look like? Be specific. And then finally, go through your lesson, map it out in your mind, ask yourself what could go wrong. Identify at least 2 potential problems. Indicate how you will prevent or manage those problems. So in order to give you a little bit of practice in lesson planning, today you're going to do a lesson plan just for practice. So it's going to be on the topic of visiting a restaurant. Your students are going to be high school students who are relative newcomers to the United States. You can choose their level. They could be 1, 2, or 3, or some combination of those levels. This lesson is going to follow a lesson where they have already been introduced to a lot of food vocabulary. So try not to make vocabulary the focus of your lesson. This can be any kind of lesson related to the topic of visiting a restaurant. So you could do a social studies lesson, a math lesson, an ELA lesson, maybe even a music lesson, but somehow related to this topic of visiting a restaurant. Think of it as part of a sequence, sort of have an eye toward what may be coming next after the lesson that you plan. And again, this is an activity to give you some practice in lesson planning, to help you think through all those different elements in the template. The lesson plan you create today is not going to be graded, but you will post it to the discussion board today, and you'll get feedback from your peers. And that feedback may be helpful as you go to create your lesson plan for your final project as well. So go on over to the task list and see all the details and activities for day 13, and I will see you next time.